listening to Overwatch League Daily, your daily source for Overwatch League news, scores, and more. Here's your host, KickedTripod.
Good morning, Overwatch League fans. This is your Overwatch League daily episode for February 16th, 2018. Today, I'm joined by Yiska for part 2 of our Overwatch League trade and signings series as we ramp up to stage 2. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So there are 2 quick things I wanted to bring up. First and foremost, there will be no show for Saturday. I'm just trying to rest up and get over a nasty cold before we get into stage 2. And so I'm going to take an extra day here. The other thing is we're going to talk about the signings and potential signings of the Seoul Dynasty, NYXL, Gladiators, and Mayhem. Those are the 4 teams that we're going to discuss today. So let's go ahead, Yiska, let's jump right into it. And let's talk about the Seoul Dynasty. So earlier this week, the Seoul Dynasty, it seemed, had confirmed that they signed Gambler to their team. And then it has since then been confirmed that he has not signed with the team. However, let's entertain for a moment. If Seoul were to sign Gambler, what would he bring to the team?
What is interesting about Gambler is, now he's always been a shot caller, and from what we've heard about him from other Koreans is that when Gambler tells you something, you follow. And that is actually very, very strange in Korean culture, because Gambler is only 19 years old. And in a culture that still sees the leader or the leadership role going to the guy that is the oldest, in this case Ro Jae-hong, this is an interesting dynamic that they have to overcome. Now, obviously, there's different types of leadership. There's social leadership, and there's in-game leadership. And if you can bridge that gap, then yeah, I think Gambler and Gambler-type players can have huge impact.
Now, when I think of teams with excellent support lines, I think of NYXL with Ark and Jonak and Seoul Dynasty with Toby and Jaehong. Do you think that there's room for a player like Gambler on this team?
I think Seoul has also realized that people can fall sick. And if people tend to fall sick, they tend to also put the other players from other teams at jeopardy because everyone else is practicing and playing in the same facility. So you sort of need to have backup plans. The problem with Gambler, I see, is the principle that integrating a shot caller into a team is probably the hardest. Because he needs to know what types of personalities he's directing around. He needs to take into consideration what their play styles are, personal preferences, where people actually are the strongest. So bringing in a new shot caller into a team environment will always be an uphill battle. Now, in terms of individual play, Gambler is a rather passive Lucio. He's not one that goes for the kills or that is known for his movement. And that is obviously probably part of most of his computational power, if you will, to go to the shot calling role. At the same time, he also doesn't die a lot. So he seems to be in good positions. He seems to facilitate a lot. A lot of his power seems to be coming from intangibles. If you look at his blank stats, they're not that impressive, but the rate at which his teams win team fights, especially when he's using his power play tools, his ultimate, they tend to win more than other Lucios. So in general, if he was to be brought on, and we can't be sure at this point because he has publicly denied it, I think this could bring more leadership to Seoul, which they are clearly missing. And to the people saying that this should fall on Ro Jae-hong, I don't necessarily think so. I think Jae-hong was impactful when he was the emotional leader, not necessarily the strategical leader, and when he was concentrated on his own play, and only then was he one of the best flex supports. And we've seen in the last meta, arguably flex support was the most important role in the game. So if he had then already concentrated more on his individual play, I can only guess that Seoul would have looked better, especially towards the end of the season, than they did.
So we're seeing two Korean rosters, Seoul Dynasty and NYXL, both looking at bringing on Lucio players. Do you think it's a coincidence that Korean teams are picking up players known for their Lucio as the meta changes and arguably becomes more Lucio-centric?
The obvious answer is no, because we're likely moving back into a Lucio meta, away from Mercy now. We might still see her, but yeah, a lot of experts think that Lucio is going to have way more playtime than he did in Stage 1, where he was only ever played on, I think, mostly King of the Hill maps, when teams felt that their Zenyatta was outmatched and was mostly sniped much better by their opposition, and a dead Zenyatta is, yes, less useful than a Lucio that can still peel. So that was mostly the justification for bringing Lucio over Zenyatta. Now, both for NYXL and Seoul Dynasty, they had a problem in the sense that, as I alluded to in the first question, that they only had one of these support players. And I think for the most part, that's actually reckless. Because what happens if someone has an injury, or has an illness, or someone needs surgery? For instance, carpal tunnel syndrome or something. Obviously, things that gamers often get and then need a long recovery time. So I think it's responsible to have someone that could play a serviceable backup for that specific hero or that specific role. And for instance, someone that did it fairly well in Stage 1 was Verbro, who moved into the Mercy role. And while it looked like you lose a little bit by not fielding Anko, he was still fairly plug and play for the most part, which might also just be the case for the team structure that Valiant has. Now, it's different in the case of Gambler or in the case of Seoul Dynasty, for the reasons I mentioned before, because leadership positions are different. And Lucio is also the position that likely should shot call the most, because yes, you can probably do a lot with your mechanics, and we've seen that, for instance, in contenders by players like Boink, who had sick fragging on Lucio, also would really secure kills that could win you games, especially when they shut down huge ultimates. But for the most part, I think the value of the Lucio is that he's still fairly effective by not giving 100% attention towards your own mechanics and just facilitating your team while you shot call from the back. Also, the position you're in that very moment is likely to have pretty good overview. So Lucio seems to be the designated shot calling position, and what part of shot calling happens there is probably different depending on the team. So you have probably Lucio for the ult management and then macro calls, while a Winston should ideally target call and tell the diving DPS members where to go on. All of these things are obviously also meta dependent, so we'll see. But in general, I think this is more a move towards, if in the case of Animo, because Arc is a sick main support. In the case of Animo, it's probably more to have a backup support than actually recruiting someone that needs to fix holes in the team of New York Excelsior.
So in this time between stages, we saw the London Spitfire trade, or I guess send Rascal to the Dallas Fuel for some sort of compensation. We don't necessarily know exactly what that is. We also saw them do the same with Fissure to the LA Gladiators, which I think both in some way are kind of surprising. But in your opinion, how does Fissure fit into an LA Gladiators team that already has iRemix?
So the first thing you have to say about Fissure is that, in my opinion, he was probably the best player in Overwatch League that wasn't a starter for his team. And I think that's almost unarguable. Fissure is likely a top 3 tank in the league. He's that good. Problem is that in front of him was Gesture. And Gesture wasn't even necessarily a better tank than Fissure was. Just so happens that Gesture had a better synergy with Profit, and you just have better results this way. Now, in comes also that dynamic that you want to recreate this dive tank DPS player synergy, because if dive is played, having coordination between your Winston and your Tracer mostly, but also your Genji, helps you a lot. It forces Zenyatas to use their ultimates without much investment in terms of ultimates from those two players. Also, those two players, these ultimates aren't as important as support player ultimates. And then in the case of Prophet and Gesture, they just dry run your supports, and they either kill them or they force an ultimate without any investment whatsoever. And they have been doing that for a while. So if you want to reproduce that structure in your team, obviously it makes sense to bring Fissure, who is a target caller, and who can then also lead Asher. So if we were to see dive, I think Asher and Fissure could instantly up the level of play that Gladiators is able to play during dive metas, because most of the time they had these victories with these cutesy comps. I think if we look back to the preseason, their most successful stuff was actually the Protector Parasite or the Pirate Ship stuff on Junkertown, and whenever Hydration was allowed to play Pharah. Now, this doesn't work on every map, and we've also heard a lot about the incoming triple or quad tank meta. Now, in that regard, Fissure is also an excellent Reinhardt, if that was to be played. I trust him to have a solid Orisa. So in that regard, he could definitely instantly replace iRemix. Now, the alert listener may ask, why did Fissure end up on a team like Gladiators? And I happen to know that more teams than just Gladiators try to get Fissure, because he's that good. And especially teams with already Korean DPS core players, because obviously the synergy would instantly be there. So it's possible that either Fissure saw something in Gladiators, or that they gave him more resources, gave him the assurance that he would start over other positions in other teams. And I think that's also Fissure's primary goal, is to play Overwatch and not just freeload. And that addition happens to also pan out for Gladiators, I think. In the long run, this is a move that could put Gladiators into a mid-table team. And if they get one or two more players, especially in the off-tank role, and maybe one more DPS, then depending on the quality of these signings, it is quite possible that the Gladiators are the most improved teams in terms of what they were able to do in the signing window.
All right, last but not least, we have the Florida Mayhem. Obviously, Saya Player and Awesome Guy are very different than the Swedes and Finns currently on the Mayhem. Can Mineral and Ryder incorporate these two very different groups with very different styles of play into a cohesive team?
Well, you would certainly hope so. The problem is that Florida probably still doesn't have the right tools to make it work. And this isn't necessarily even about the players, because for the longest time now, Mineral has been the only official coach in that team. So yes, they have a chief of gaming and they have a general manager, and I don't know how hands-on they are, but even then, that is not enough. So assuming that only Mineral has been coaching them, how anyone was going to think that 6-1 player to coach was going to work out when you have to cover comms, when you have to cover macro and micro strategy, individual coaching, this doesn't work. So with Ryder coming in, this is probably their most important recruitment. At the same time, it's still not enough. If you look at the teams that are very well coached, in my opinion, for instance, like a Boston, they have 3 coaches. So they have a head coach, 2 assistant coaches, they have an analyst, and then they have famously a president of gaming, Huck, who's also very hands-on with that team. Florida has 2 people, and maybe someone that does most of the caretaking stuff, but even then we've heard that Tivik needs to drive the bus there. So from the outside, this looks to me like it was seriously a neglect of supporting staff. And also, obviously not enough players. So now with Saya Player and Awesome Guy coming in, we finally can relieve Logix of a couple of these roles. Because, yes, it's true that Logix hasn't been looking great ever since he played his first game on LAN. And that is not really offline. He played very well at TakeOver. This is specifically on the LAN client. So he hasn't been looking great in the Contenders playoffs, but he also hasn't been looking as dominant as he was back in Contenders EU, when he basically dominated everyone on his Tracer. So that is probably also still left to the LAN client, probably a bigger stage that eats away at the ego maybe a little bit. That is probably because his champion pool is very stretched, much more so than it was before. So he needs to cover Widow, he needs to cover McCree, he needs to cover Tracer, very different aim styles. And with the recruitment of Saya Player, who's famously one of the best hit-scan DPS in Korea, and has been called that by his peers for a while, and it was actually quite surprising, I think for most experts, that he wasn't immediately in Overwatch League. And now this puts me in a mood where I think, yes, this will help that team a lot. The question obviously is the language barrier that we have. And the good thing is that they once again recruited one hit-scan DPS, who also will play the Tracer mostly. And if it was to happen, also, of course, the Soldier or whatever have you in the hit-scan department. But the fact that they recruited a tank with him, again, sort of matches the theme that all these other teams have tried to do, which is to pair a great micro shot calling tank, and an aggressive one, with their Korean DPS player, and therefore get very good target selection and therefore very good fundamental structure within a team. So they also obviously all come from Meta Athena, so they sort of already worked as a unit. You can hope that this helps them sort of weave together these two structures of these teams, where it's still possible for Logix to play certain maps, where Tivix still has to flex a lot, because he needs to play all these projectile heroes, because this won't be covered by these other recruitments. Side player, again, mostly hit-scan player. So, now also with Zappis coming in, a player that was part of NIP, and then Giganti, but especially NIP, who played famously a lot of triple and quad tank. Maybe they can siphon some of that knowledge from that triple tank and quad tank meta back in the day and put it into their stage 2 performance, which would boost them, because presumably that's what we're going to play on a lot of maps now. So bottom line for me is 2 coaches is not enough. They should probably stack up one more player. 10 looks like a good number, especially if they get one more support in case someone gets sick. And then Florida looks decently improved. If it is enough to get out of the bottom ranks in the Overwatch League, I'm still not quite sure. And if that happens, it probably won't happen immediately. I don't think they brought any magical pieces that could instantly improve their performance. I think there will be some growing to do for them, especially whenever you incorporate new players, but especially players that speak a different language and come from a different culture, and then also more so if you have the coaching staff. I think if Florida gets to be like an 8th place team, we would have to see their performance rather in stage 3 and 4, rather than their performance now in stage 2.
My thanks again to Yiska for joining me to wrap up our series on the signings for Overwatch League so far. Make sure to follow him on Twitter at YiskaOut. Again, no show tomorrow, but I will be back on Sunday with Bren from Overwatch League to discuss just the teams overall as they transition from stage 1 to stage 2 and what he thinks we might be able to expect. If you like the show, make sure to follow, subscribe, all that good stuff, and make sure to subscribe on your podcast app of choice so you don't miss future episodes. You can also watch or listen to the show on the front page of winstonslab.com. If you have any questions or ideas for the show, feel free to email me at overwatchleaguedaily@gmail.com. And of course, you can find links to everything at overwatchleaguedaily.com. Thanks again to Yiska. Enjoy your Saturday. Go outside, do something fun. And I'll be back on Sunday with Brent.